We really tend to look back at our ancient ancestors with, let's be honest, a fair bit of modern arrogance, don't we? We just assume that people who lived thousands of years ago were primitive or passive or just simple. We picture them living in this chaotic state of anarchy until kings finally showed up, violently swinging clubs around, or maybe just quietly picking berries while the men did all the heavy lifting. But actually, the physical and historical evidence tells a completely different, incredibly sophisticated story. So, welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to completely unlearn human history. In this explainer, we've got a really dynamic roadmap lined up to shatter some of those old assumptions. First up, we'll look at justice before the gavel. Then, we're going to trace a bizarre journey from potion to firearm. And finally, we'll uncover the reality of prehistoric athletes. Let's get right into it. All right, part one, justice before the gavel. Let's take a look into prehistoric law. Okay, let's dive into this. We usually assume that justice, the actual machinery of punishing criminals, arrived with civilization. We picture massive cities, powerful kings, written codes carved into stone pillars, the whole shebang. But long before agriculture, humans living in highly mobile bands of, say, 20 to 50 people were already building justice systems. Think about it. In a group that small, your reputation wasn't just some social flex, it was literal survival. You were completely, entirely interdependent. The anthropologist Christopher Boehm actually studied 48 distinct hunter-gatherer societies across the globe and found something totally fascinating. They were not anarchic at all. They operated on what he called a reverse dominance hierarchy. In most primate societies, the alphas take the best food and just dominate the weak, right? But ancient hunter-gatherers flipped this entirely on its head. The collective group dominated the individual. If anyone tried to accumulate too much power, hoard resources, or bully anyone else, the group actively and deliberately worked together to suppress that alpha behavior.
And this active suppression of power built into a remarkably methodical four-stage justice system. First up, gossip. And we're not talking about idle chatter here. It was an actual consensus-building mechanism to establish that someone's behavior was becoming a problem. If that didn't work, they escalated to stage two, which was public ridicule. This was a formal leveling mechanism, a way to take the offender's status down a notch in front of absolutely everyone. Stage three was ostracism. Now, being shunned in a harsh, Paleolithic landscape, that was essentially a delayed death sentence, because solo survival was just nearly impossible. Finally, if the offender was a chronic threat who just ignored all interventions, the group moved to stage four, execution. This wasn't murder in the way we think of it. It was a carefully deliberated, collective consensus to remove an intolerable threat to the community.
And this just brilliantly illustrates the contrast between ancient egalitarianism and what we typically call civilized justice. When cities and kings finally emerged, we got laws written down, like Hammurabi's Code around 1750 BCE. Now, it did bring the famous eye for an eye logic, but it also introduced something that hunter-gatherers had fought tirelessly to prevent: codified inequality. Under Hammurabi, if a free man blinded another free man, sure, he lost his eye. But if he blinded a slave, he just paid a fine. The physical injury was exactly the same, but the punishment depended entirely on the victim's social class. Civilization quite literally wrote inequality directly into the law and then called it justice. Moving right along to part two, from potion to firearm, the story of the accidental weapon. We so often think of major technological leaps, especially guns, as the product of purposeful military genius. We imagine these brilliant engineers sitting down at a desk to design a weapon of mass destruction. But the truth is way stranger and honestly a lot more accidental. Back in the 9th century, Chinese Taoist alchemists were mixing saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur. They were not trying to invent a weapon, not at all. They were actually trying to brew an elixir of immortality. But instead, the mixture exploded. Just picture the scene: singed beards and completely burned down workshops. They called it huo yao, or fire medicine. And for generations, this failed pharmaceutical was just used for fireworks and festival entertainment. Nobody was out there trying to conquer the world. They were quite literally just chasing eternal life. So that brings us to a really fascinating question. How on earth did an immortality potion end up destroying European castles? Well, when Chinese engineers finally realized the military potential of gunpowder, they started making bamboo fire lances. Fast forward to the 1200s, the Mongols invade China, encounter these weapons, absorb the tech, and basically act as this massive, accidental delivery system across Eurasia. Once cannons finally reached Europe, traditional, tall, thin medieval castle walls became totally obsolete. Just like that, enough gunpowder-driven force could punch right through them. So military engineers had to scramble, abandoning those classic tall castles for really thick, low-angled bastions and star forts that were designed specifically to deflect cannon fire. The firearm as we know it today is basically the result of a centuries-long game of technological telephone. From that 9th century accidental potion, we get 12th century bamboo fire lances. Then craftsmen realized, hey, we probably need bronze tubes instead, which led to hand cannons. By the 15th century, the matchlock was invented. This was a huge deal. It was the first mechanical firing device that let a single soldier actually aim with two hands while a trigger lowered a burning cord into the powder. And finally, we arrive at the 17th century with the flintlock. Each step along the way wasn't some singular stroke of genius. It was just incremental engineering, basically people solving the immediate practical bugs of the version that came right before it.
The absolute culmination of this massive technological shift arrived around 1610, when a French gunsmith named Marin Le Bourgeois perfected the flintlock. It used flint striking steel to create sparks, which completely removed the need for carrying around a glowing, open match cord. Combine that with the late 17th century invention of the socket bayonet, which brilliantly fit right over the outside of the barrel so you could still shoot, and warfare fundamentally changed. You no longer needed vulnerable musketeers being protected by rows of dedicated pikemen. Every single soldier became both a shooter and a spearman simultaneously. This sparked what's known as the infantry revolution, completely reshaping European battlefields for centuries.
Which brings us to our final myth today. Part 3, prehistoric athletes and the reality of the highly active cave woman. Now, what's really interesting about this comparison is how it shatters a deeply ingrained stereotype. For a huge chunk of the 20th century, the dominant narrative just assumed this biologically inevitable division of labor. Men were out hunting dangerous game, and women were passively hanging back at camp, gathering berries. But modern science begs to differ. A landmark 2017 study from the University of Cambridge compared the arm bones of Neolithic agricultural women to modern female athletes, and the results were just staggering. These prehistoric women had upper arm bone strength that didn't just rival, but actually outmatched living elite-level female rowers. We're talking about modern Olympians who train for hours every single day. This totally shattered the whole passive cave woman illusion. This biological reality is driven by something called Wolff's Law. Bone is living tissue, right? It actively remodels and thickens in direct response to mechanical stress. These women were enduring what was essentially near-daily, lifelong resistance training. Think of their daily routine as the ultimate prehistoric workout, hours of grinding grain by leaning their full body weight onto heavy cornstones. It meant hauling heavy water and firewood, intensely scraping and stretching heavy animal hides for clothing, carrying children while also hauling loads, and performing sustained agricultural labor. Their skeletal structures are literally permanent biological printouts of seriously demanding physical work. And it goes even further than agricultural labor. So the crucial point to take away here is this number, 30 to 50%. A 2020 study analyzed a 9,000-year-old burial site in the Andes and found a young adult female buried with a big game hunting toolkit. This prompted researchers to rigorously re-examine similar burials all across the Americas. And guess what? When they stopped making assumptions and actually tested the skeletal remains, they discovered that up to half of all big game hunter burials were actually female. Female participation in hunting wasn't some rare anomaly. It was a deeply common, completely accepted reality. This brings us to a massive realization. For decades, whenever an early archaeologist found a grave with hunting tools, they simply defaulted to, oh, this is a male hunter, full stop. 20th century academics quietly projected their own rigid social expectations about what male and female roles were, quote-unquote, supposed to look like, backward onto prehistoric data. The bones themselves never actually supported the passive cave woman narrative. Researchers just weren't looking with the right tools or an unbiased eye. When you step back and look at the whole picture, from the methodical, egalitarian fairness of hunter-gatherer justice, to the completely accidental path from immortality potions to firearms, to the elite athletic reality of prehistoric women, you realize just how much of what we know is really just assumptions we've inherited. We owe it to ourselves to look at the raw evidence. So I want to leave you with one final provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. With all our modern arrogance and our deeply held cultural biases, what are future archaeologists going to get completely wrong about us?
Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into something that absolutely blows my mind. You know those neat, tidy narratives we always see in history books? Well, it turns out when you actually look at the messy, physical reality left behind in the dirt, those stories get completely upended. We're going to look at how modern science, rigorous analysis, and honestly just some sheer archaeological luck have forced us to totally rewrite the story of human progress. Because, as you'll see, the history we think we know, it's often just a highly sanitized version shaped way more by the assumptions of 20th century historians than by the actual folks who were literally living it. So let me ask you a question. What do a 9th century immortality potion and the arm bones of a Neolithic woman have in common? It's a pretty bizarre contrast, right? I mean, you definitely wouldn't think monks in ancient China and prehistoric women in Central Europe would share any sort of connection whatsoever. On the surface, we're talking about completely different eras, completely different continents, and completely different sciences, chemistry and biomechanics.
But they actually do share a massive connection. The crucial point here is that both of these case studies use cold, hard, physical evidence to absolutely shatter some of our biggest, most oversimplified assumptions about how human history actually unfolded. They reveal a past that was far more accidental, far more physically demanding, and just infinitely more complex than those standard textbook summaries would ever have you believe.
Which brings us to part 1, the failed immortality potion. Now this is just the ultimate irony of history. Imagine this. You've got these monks, and they're desperately trying to synthesize a pharmaceutical potion to cure death, right? But instead, they inadvertently created huoyao, or fire medicine. In their pursuit of eternal life, they were mixing and heating all these minerals, and they accidentally engineered an explosion that practically singed their beards off and burned their workshops to the ground. Literally nobody in that room was trying to invent a weapon. And actually the name fire medicine carries this faint, kind of embarrassing memory of its original purpose as a completely failed potion, rather than, this massive engine of future conquest.
So, what actually happened? Well, when you break down the chemistry roughly by weight, using a ratio of about 75 to 15 to 10, the saltpeter acts as a rapid oxidizer. When it gets heated up, it releases oxygen incredibly fast, which feeds a combustion reaction that produces this sudden, extremely violent expansion of gas. And that expanding gas? That is the entire secret behind literally everything gunpowder would eventually become. Whether that meant launching celebratory fireworks into the night sky, or eventually launching lethal metal projectiles out of a tube with enough force to punch straight through steel armor. But here's the thing. This wasn't some singular light bulb moment of genius invention. No, it was a really slow, multi-century migration of knowledge. It started back in the Song dynasty with the fire lance. And guys, this was literally just a bamboo tube strapped to a spear that spewed out flame and debris. Kind of wild, right? From there, once craftsmen figured out how to cast bronze tubes to actually contain all that intense pressure, we got the hand cannon. Then, over centuries of just practical, incremental refinement to solve very specific battlefield problems, we saw these massive mechanical leaps. We got the matchlock, which finally let a soldier aim with both hands, then the weather-resistant flintlock, and eventually the percussion cap.
And how did it spread so far? Well, military campaigns and cross-cultural trade acted as these massive delivery systems for this new chemistry. When the Mongols invaded China in the 1200s, they absorbed this technology and carried it westward. This acted as a massive, completely accidental delivery system across enormous distances, way faster than trade caravans ever could have. By the time it reached Europe, this slow march of chemistry quietly but fundamentally reshaped the balance of power. It neutralized heavily armored knights who had trained their entire lives, and it basically rendered tall, thin medieval castle walls completely obsolete almost overnight.
And then, by the late 17th century, we get this small metal ring innovation that created what historians call the infantry revolution. Before the socket bayonet, armies were relying on these really complex, tightly choreographed formations of musketeers who had to be protected by pikemen. But by simply attaching a blade around the outside of the barrel, instead of plugging it directly into the muzzle, soldiers could now shoot and spear. This one little tweak entirely eliminated the need for pikemen, fundamentally reshaping how European armies organized themselves for the next 200 years.
Okay, let's pivot. Part 2, the passive cavewoman myth. Get this. A landmark 2017 Cambridge study led by Alison McIntosh looked really closely at ancient skeletons from Central Europe that spanned about 6,000 years of early agricultural history. And the slightly embarrassing reality for anyone with a modern gym membership is that these ancient women were naturally getting absolutely jacked. The researchers actually compared them to modern sedentary women, runners, soccer players, and even elite rowers. What they found was that prehistoric women possessed a level of sustained functional upper body strength that just simply doesn't exist in modern populations today.
And the way we know this is all due to a principle called Wolff's Law. It's this biological rule that basically turns ancient skeletons into permanent printouts of physical fitness. See, bones aren't just passive structures. They actively restructure themselves to handle physical loads more efficiently. So finding skeletons with this incredible level of structural reinforcement proves that intense, heavy manual labor wasn't just some anomaly. It was the baseline, normal, everyday reality for women across this entire prehistoric period.
When we look at this comparison, the data is just staggering. Ancient agricultural labor demanded a level of sustained physical stress that exceeds even dedicated modern elite athletes who train multiple hours a day. We are literally looking at bone-loading patterns consistent with repetitive, highly demanding upper body labor over an entire lifetime. It completely dwarfs the physical capacity of our modern sedentary lifestyles, and honestly, blows right past our most highly trained athletes.
And their daily routines explain exactly why their bones were so incredibly dense. I mean, processing grain before mechanized milling meant pushing your entire upper body weight into a heavy grinding stone for hours every single day. Add to that hauling large volumes of water over long distances, processing really tough animal hides into leather, and carrying children around while doing all of it. These tasks were essentially lifelong, full-body resistance training sessions, demanding serious grip strength, forearm endurance, and shoulder stability.
So I want you to look at this number, 30 to 50%. Think about what that represents for a second, because we are about to completely shatter that deeply ingrained man-the-hunter model. You know the one. It shaped museum dioramas and pop culture for a century. But as it turns out, the physical reality tells a much, much different story.
A landmark 2020 study of a 9,000-year-old Andes burial site forced researchers to re-examine historical data across the Americas. When they analyzed a wider sample of early hunter burials, they found that between 30% and 50% of them were female. Let that sink in. This proved that female participation in big game hunting wasn't just possible, it was remarkably common. It was an accepted, fully integrated role within these ancient populations.
So why didn't we know this? Well, for decades, 20th century archaeologists were quietly projecting their own rigid cultural assumptions about gender right onto these graves. The default assumption used to be super straightforward. Oh, there's a hunting toolkit in the grave, must be a male hunter. End of story. It took modern researchers using highly sophisticated CT scanning and rigorous statistical sex determination methods directly on the skeletons themselves to reveal that this default interpretation had been systematically wrong the entire time. They finally, just let the physical evidence speak for itself.
All right, bringing it all together. Part 3, Rethinking Our Human Past.
Getting this historical record right matters profoundly. Whether we're tracing the total accident that was the invention of gunpowder or uncovering the astonishing physical power of Neolithic women, the actual physical evidence points to a past organized by pragmatism, not neat, tidy stereotypes. And this is vital, because the stories we tell about our deep ancestral past inevitably shape the assumptions we carry forward today about what is biologically natural or inevitable in our society. We're actually learning that even the physical strength gap between men and women might be shaped way more by specific historical labor patterns than by some fixed biological constant.
So I'll leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. If our bones and our artifacts tell a vastly different story than our textbooks, what other historical myths are we still blindly believing? Because when we actually look closely at the evidence left in the dirt, human history is infinitely more complex, chaotic, and impressive than the simple sanitized stereotypes we've been fed all our lives. I mean, if a failed potion can conquer the world, and prehistoric women were literally stronger than modern Olympians, what else is hiding in the ground right beneath our feet, just waiting for us to finally look closely enough to see it?